Washington cold case that shocked the community began on May 1, 2001, when 24-year-old Chandra Levy canceled her gym membership and searched Rock Creek Park on her computer. By nightfall, the ambitious graduate student from Modesto had vanished from the nation's capital without a trace. Her apartment sat untouched, her internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons abandoned, her parents' daily phone calls unanswered. For 13 months, hope clung to whispers and rumors while cameras swarmed around Congressman Gary Condit, whose secret relationship with Chandra ignited a media firestorm. Then a dog walker discovered her remains hidden beneath Rock Creek's ancient trees. Years later, Igmar Gwandike was convicted of her murder, only to have his conviction overturned when star witness testimony crumbled. The case was dropped, the suspect deported, justice left hanging in Washington's humid air. But how does a young woman's bright future become a cold case that divides a nation? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Spring arrived early in Washington that year. Cherry blossoms dotted the Potomac while interns hurried between marble buildings carrying coffee and ambition in equal measure. Chandra Levy belonged to this world of possibility, her internship at the Federal Bureau of Prisons opening doors she'd dreamed about since childhood in Modesto. But May 1st, 2001 would mark the end of dreaming and the beginning of nightmare. That Tuesday morning, Chandra made what seemed like routine decisions. She cancelled her Washington Sports Club membership by phone, telling the clerk she was moving home to California soon. Her computer's browser history would later reveal searches for Rock Creek Park, MapQuest directions, and jogging trails. The digital breadcrumbs painted a picture of someone planning an outdoor adventure on a beautiful spring day. By 1 p.m., her keycard showed she'd left her apartment in the DuPont Circle area. Security cameras captured her walking toward the elevator, purse slung over her shoulder, looking like any other young professional heading out for lunch. She never returned. 3,000 miles away in Modesto, Robert and Susan Levy waited for their daughter's daily phone call. Chandra was disciplined about checking in, especially as her internship neared its end. The phone remained silent through Tuesday evening, then Wednesday morning. By noon, Susan's motherly intuition twisted into dread. Something was wrong. Robert dialed Chandra's cell phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring echoing through their modest California home. The device that had connected them across the continent now mocked them with its silence. He called her apartment landline next, then her friends, then anyone who might know where she was. Jennifer Baker, Chandra's closest friend in Washington, hadn't heard from her since Monday. Neither had her supervisor at the Bureau of Prisons. "We need to call the police," Susan said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She had raised 2 children and knew the difference between teenage rebellion and genuine danger. This wasn't like Chandra. This wasn't like her careful, responsible daughter, who scheduled her life down to 15-minute increments. Robert agreed, but 3,000 miles of distance made everything harder. Who do you call when your daughter disappears in a city where you know no one? They started with Chandra's landlord, who agreed to check her apartment. Everything was normal, he reported. Bed made, clothes in the closet, computer still on, no signs of struggle, no indication of hasty packing. It was as if she'd simply stepped out and forgotten to come back. By Wednesday evening, the Levys were booking flights to Washington. Robert's business background kicked in as he compiled lists of Chandra's contacts, her routine, anywhere she might have gone. Susan clutched her daughter's high school photo, the one where Chandra smiled at the camera with such confidence about her future. Neither parent slept that night. Metropolitan Police Officer John Miller took the missing person report on Thursday morning, May 3, 2001. At 24, Chandra Levy was technically an adult who could disappear if she wanted to, but her parents' distress and the unusual circumstances, apartment untouched, no contact with family or friends, elevated the case beyond routine runaway status. The report documented basic facts. Chandra Ann Levy, 5'3", 110 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing dark clothing on May 1st. Born in Cleveland, raised in Modesto, University of Southern California, graduate. No known boyfriends in Washington, though her parents mentioned she'd been happy lately in a way that suggested romance. Miller walked through Chandra's DuPont Circle apartment with building management and her distraught parents. Everything appeared normal. Her exercise clothes were laid out on the bed as if she'd been planning to work out. Her purse was missing, along with her keys and Metro card. The computer was on, browser open to weather-conform, showing Washington's forecast for May 1st, sunny, high of 78 degrees. Robert Levy studied his daughter's desk with a businessman's eye for detail. Her calendar showed appointments through May 8th, including lunch with a friend and a dentist appointment back in Modesto. She wouldn't miss these, he told Miller. Chandra doesn't miss appointments. The officer took notes, gathered photos, and assured the family that detectives would be assigned soon. Missing person cases in D.C. numbered in the thousands annually, most resolved within 48 hours. But something about Chandra's methodical lifestyle and her parents' obvious devotion made Miller hope this wouldn't become one of the others. The cases that haunted detectives for years because the missing never came home. By afternoon, the report was filed, and detectives Ralph Durant and Lawrence Gaynor inherited what would become the most scrutinized missing person case in Washington's recent history. The first crack in the case came not from police work, but from whispered conversations in Washington's political circles. Chandra Levy wasn't just any missing intern. Multiple sources began telling investigators about her connection to Congressman Gary Condit, the California Democrat who represented Modesto in the House of Representatives. Condit, 53 and married with children, initially denied any personal relationship with Chandra beyond constituent services. But as detectives pressed harder, the story changed. Yes, he'd met with her. Yes, they'd had dinner. No, it wasn't romantic. The transcript of his first formal interview revealed a man carefully parsing every word, each answer technically true but deliberately incomplete. Did you know Miss Levy personally? Detective Durant asked. I know a lot of people from my district, Condit replied. Did you have a personal relationship with her? I've had meals with many constituents. Were you romantically involved with Miss Levy? I'm a married man with a family. Each non-answer fueled more questions. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Condit's office and Chandra's apartment and cell phone. Restaurant receipts placed them together at intimate venues around Washington. Flight attendant Linda Zamsky came forward with claims that Condit had asked her to sign an affidavit denying their own affair, an affair she said lasted for years. The media seized on every revelation. Cable news devoted hours to speculation about the congressman and the missing intern. Reporters camped outside Condit's Ceres, California home, badgering his wife Carolyn and their children. His carefully constructed political career began crumbling under the weight of innuendo and half-truths. Susan Levy watched her daughter's story transform from missing person case to political scandal. They're not looking for Chandra, she told reporters. They're looking for headlines. But even she wondered what else Gary Condit might be hiding about her daughter's final days. The FBI's entry into the Chandra Levy case in mid-May 2001 elevated it from local missing person to federal investigation. Special Agent Bradley Garrett opened a thick file that would consume the next year of his career and haunt him for decades after. The Bureau brought resources that D.C. police couldn't match. Behavioral analysts, computer forensics experts, nationwide databases. They reconstructed Chandra's final weeks with methodical precision. Credit card records, Metro fare card usage, security camera footage from buildings along her route. The digital archaeology of a young woman's life painted a picture of someone excited about returning to California, but conflicted about leaving Washington. Garrett's team discovered that Chandra had been apartment hunting in California while maintaining her Washington lease. She'd researched graduate schools for the following year, but also looked into extending her internship. Her computer's browser history revealed a young woman planning for multiple futures, uncertain which path to choose. The FBI's psychological profile suggested Chandra wasn't suicidal or prone to disappearing voluntarily. Her methodical personality, strong family ties, and clear career goals made running away unlikely. But the profile also noted her secretive nature regarding romantic relationships, particularly her involvement with Condit. Phone records revealed the complexity of that relationship. Calls to Condit's private line often lasted 30 minutes or more. Text messages recovered from her phone company showed intimate exchanges hidden behind careful language. Missing you became thinking of our conversation. Love you became value our friendship. Agent Garrett interviewed dozens of Chandra's friends and colleagues, building a timeline of her final week. She'd seemed happy but distracted, excited about going home but sad about leaving. Several friends mentioned she'd been seeing someone special but wouldn't reveal details. The federal case file grew thick with witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative leads. But despite the FBI's technological advantages and nationwide reach, Chandra Levy remained missing. The case that had captured a nation's attention was becoming the investigation that would challenge every assumption about missing persons and political scandals. By summer 2001, Chandra Levy's face stared back from telephone poles across Washington. The missing person posters multiplied weekly in coffee shops, on metro platforms, outside government buildings where she'd once walked with such purpose. "Have you seen Chandra?" they asked, offering her parents' phone number and a $25,000 0 cents reward for information. Susan Levy personally placed many of the posters, traveling from Modesto to Washington monthly to keep her daughter's case visible. She carried rolls of tape and stacks of photos, refusing to let Chandra become another forgotten missing person. At each location, she smoothed the edges carefully, as if the precision might somehow bring her daughter home. The reward money came from the Levy family's modest savings and donations from Modesto residents who'd watched Chandra grow up. Robert had liquidated his retirement account to fund the search, hiring private investigators when police leads went cold. Their comfortable middle-class life became consumed by the hunt for answers. Community volunteers organized searches in Rock Creek Park and surrounding areas, though police had already covered the same ground multiple times. Psychics called with visions. Conspiracy theorists offered elaborate theories. None led anywhere, but the Levies followed every tip with desperate hope. The posters began fading by August, rain and heat weathering Chandra's smiling face until her features blurred into unrecognizable shadows. Susan replaced them religiously, carrying new stacks on each Washington visit. Someone saw her, she'd tell anyone who listened. Someone knows what happened. Local shop owners started recognizing Susan's routine, offering her coffee and encouragement as she moved from block to block. The mother searching for her daughter became a familiar sight in DuPont Circle, a living reminder of an unsolved mystery that held the nation's attention through the hot Washington summer. By Labor Day, fresh posters competed with back-to-school announcements and autumn event flyers. Chandra's case was entering its 5th month with no resolution in sight. September 11, 2001 changed everything for America, including the search for Chandra Levy. The terrorist attacks on New York and Washington dominated every news cycle, every investigation priority, every federal resource. Overnight, a missing intern became yesterday's story as the nation focused on homeland security and hunting terrorists. The timing felt like betrayal to the Levy family. After months of media attention that sometimes helped and sometimes hindered the investigation, Chandra's case disappeared from headlines. Cable news networks that had devoted hours to speculation about Gary Condit now covered anthrax scares and military actions in Afghanistan. FBI agents working Chandra's case were reassigned to terrorism task forces. Detective Doran found himself pulling security duty at federal buildings instead of following leads. The massive manhunt for a missing woman became a footnote to the manhunt for the world's most wanted terrorist. Susan Levy watched her daughter's story fade with growing desperation. Media calls stopped coming. Congressional pressure on the investigation evaporated as representatives focused on national security legislation. Even the constant paparazzi harassment of Gary Condit disappeared as photographers found more urgent subjects. The shift in priorities wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. Law enforcement resources that might have been devoted to searching for Chandra were redirected to preventing future attacks. Laboratory tests were delayed as forensics labs processed evidence from ground zero. Computer analysts who might have examined Chandra's electronic communications were tracking suspected terrorists instead. Robert Levy understood the nation's new priorities, but couldn't accept his daughter becoming collateral damage of 9/11. She was an American too, he told a diminished crowd of reporters. She deserves the same protection, the same justice as anyone else. As autumn leaves fell in Washington, the Levy family faced a harsh reality. Their daughter's disappearance was no longer the most important mystery in America. They would have to find new ways to keep the search alive in a world that had moved on to darker fears. Winter arrived early in Washington that year, and with it came the Levy family's darkest season. By December 2001, Chandra had been missing for 7 months. The investigation had stalled, public interest had evaporated, and hope was becoming harder to sustain with each passing day. Congressional hearings provided a brief flicker of renewed attention. Robert and Susan Levy testified before the House Government Reform Committee, pleading for oversight of the police investigation. Their appearance, broadcast on C-SPAN, showed the toll that months of uncertainty had taken. Robert's voice cracked as he described the family's frustration with missed opportunities and bungled leads. "The Metropolitan Police Department has failed our daughter," Susan testified, her prepared statement trembling in her hands. "They've failed to search the most obvious places. They've failed to follow up on credible tips. They've failed to treat her disappearance with the urgency it deserves." Committee members offered sympathy but little concrete action. Police Chief Charles Ramsey defended his department's work while acknowledging that mistakes had been made. Gary Condit attended the hearing but invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to answer questions that might have shed light on Chandra's final days. The hearing revealed troubling gaps in the investigation. Computer evidence had been corrupted. Witnesses had been re-interviewed so many times their memories had become unreliable. Most damaging, police had failed to conduct ground searches of Rock Creek Park despite Chandra's computer showing searches for the park on her final day. Private investigators hired by the Levy family presented evidence that police had overlooked, phone records that hadn't been analyzed, security cameras that hadn't been checked, potential witnesses who hadn't been interviewed. The hearing made clear that bureaucratic failures had compounded the tragedy of Chandra's disappearance. As 2001 ended, the Levy family returned to Modesto with no more answers than they'd had in May. But the congressional pressure had one effect. It forced police to acknowledge that the investigation needed new energy and new approaches. The morning of May 22, 2002 started like any other for Armando Morales, a 65-year-old man who walked his dog through Rock Creek Park most days. The one-year anniversary of Chandra Levy's disappearance had passed just 3 weeks earlier, marked by renewed media coverage and another plea from her parents for information. But on this warm Wednesday morning, those memories seemed distant as Morales followed his usual trail. His German Shepherd Rex bounded ahead on the steep slope above Broad Branch Creek, chasing scents through the thick undergrowth. The dog suddenly stopped and began barking frantically at something hidden beneath a pile of rotting leaves and debris. Morales called Rex back, but the dog refused to move, continuing to bark and paw at the ground. Curious and slightly annoyed, Morales pushed through the brush to see what had captured his pet's attention. What he found would end 13 months of uncertainty and begin years of legal battles. Scattered among the decomposing leaves were human bones, bleached white by a year of Washington weather. Morales immediately called 911 from his cell phone, his voice shaking as he tried to describe the location to the dispatcher. Within minutes, police cars and ambulances filled the park's narrow access roads. By afternoon, the medical examiner had confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were human, female, and had been there for close to a year. Detective Durant arrived at the scene knowing this could be the break the Levy family had prayed for. The location was less than half a mile from where Rock Creek Park trails connected to busy Connecticut Avenue, exactly the kind of secluded spot that Chandra might have reached during a morning jog. Scattered near the bones were the remnants of athletic clothing, a pair of running shoes, and what appeared to be the headphones from a portable music player. The discovery that had eluded hundreds of searchers for a year was finally revealed by a loyal dog who wouldn't stop barking at the wrong tree. The call came to the Levy family's Modesto home at 6 a.m. Pacific time on May 22nd. Robert answered the phone, expecting another routine update from investigators. But Detective Durant's voice carried a weight that made his stomach drop before the words registered. "Mr. Levy, we found human remains in Rock Creek Park. We believe they may be Chandra's." The dental records confirmation took 3 agonizing days. Dr. Jonathan Arden, the D.C. medical examiner, worked with Chandra's California dentist to compare x-rays and dental work. When the call finally came with official confirmation, Susan Levy collapsed in her kitchen. 13 months of desperate hope finally extinguished. The remains were indeed those of Chandra and Levy. She had been found less than 2 miles from her apartment, in a park she had researched on her computer the day she disappeared. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead since shortly after her disappearance, meaning the family's year of vigils and searches had been for someone who was already gone. The location raised haunting questions. The remains were found in a remote section of Rock Creek Park, far from marked trails but accessible to someone familiar with the area. Police had searched the park multiple times but had missed this particular slope, partly because it was considered too difficult for a casual jogger to reach. Found with Chandra's remains were her Walkman, her jogging shoes, and tattered remnants of the dark clothing she'd been wearing when she disappeared. Missing were her purse, her keys, and any jewelry she might have worn. The positioning of the remains suggested her body had been concealed beneath brush and leaves, either by her killer or by natural decomposition over the winter months. Susan Levy requested privacy to mourn her daughter, but also demanded answers about why the remains had gone undiscovered for so long. She was there the whole time, she told reporters through tears. She was there waiting for us to find her, and we kept looking everywhere else. The discovery that should have brought closure instead opened new wounds about investigative failures and lost time. The fallout from finding Chandra's remains was swift and merciless. Metropolitan Police Chief Charles Ramsey faced immediate calls for resignation as critics pointed out that his department had searched Rock Creek Park multiple times without finding a body that lay just hundreds of yards from marked trails. An internal investigation revealed the scope of the department's failures. The initial searches had been conducted hastily, focusing on easily accessible areas rather than the dense undergrowth where predators might conceal victims. Canine units had been used sparingly, and the searches hadn't been properly coordinated with park rangers who knew the terrain. Most damaging was the revelation that police had initially dismissed the significance of Chandra's computer searches for Rock Creek Park. The browser history showing MapQuest directions to the park wasn't analyzed until months after her disappearance, and even then, it hadn't prompted more thorough searches of remote park areas. Gary Condit's political career, already damaged by the scandal, collapsed entirely after Chandra's body was found. Voters in California's 18th congressional district had supported him through the affair allegations, but the discovery of remains he'd consistently claimed would never be found in the park destroyed his credibility permanently. He lost the Democratic primary that August, ending a 30-year political career. The medical examiner's report provided few clues about how Chandra died. The skeletal remains showed no obvious signs of trauma, and the cause of death was listed as undetermined homicide. The manner of death was clearly classified as homicide due to the concealment of the body and the remote location, but forensic evidence that might have identified the killer had been destroyed by weather and decomposition. Chandra's parents demanded accountability from police leadership and congressional oversight of the investigation. "Our daughter deserved better," Robert Levy told reporters. "The citizens of Washington deserve better. This cannot happen to another family." The case that had started as a missing person investigation was now officially a murder, but investigators were no closer to identifying a suspect than they had been when Chandra first disappeared. The years between 2003 and 2007 stretched endlessly for the Levy family as Chandra's murder investigation went cold. The initial surge of attention following the discovery of her remains faded into sporadic anniversary stories and occasional updates about investigative dead ends. Susan Levy became a familiar figure at victims' rights events across California, speaking about the need for families to never give up hope for justice. Her speeches, delivered with quiet dignity despite obvious pain, inspired other families dealing with unsolved murders and missing persons cases. She carried Chandra's photo everywhere, showing anyone who would listen the young woman her daughter had been before becoming a headline. Robert channeled his grief into lobbying for improvements in missing person investigations. He worked with congressmen and police departments to develop better protocols for searching large urban parks and preserving computer evidence. His business background helped him understand bureaucratic failures and propose systematic solutions. The couple's marriage weathered the strain that destroys many families facing similar tragedies. They attended grief counseling and gradually learned to support each other through the worst days. Holidays were particularly difficult. Chandra's empty chair at family gatherings served as a constant reminder of the future that had been stolen. Meanwhile, the investigation languished in the Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Detective Durant retired in 2005, taking with him years of institutional knowledge about the case. New detectives inherited thick files, but no fresh leads. DNA testing of evidence from the scene had yielded partial profiles that didn't match any suspects in law enforcement databases. The Levys visited Washington annually on the anniversary of Chandra's disappearance, maintaining a ritual of remembrance that kept her story alive in media coverage. But after 5 years, even sympathetic reporters struggled to find new angles on a case that seemed permanently stalled. The family's greatest fear was that Chandra would be forgotten, that her killer would escape justice simply by outlasting public attention. They refused to let that happen, even as hope for resolution faded with each passing year. Everything changed in 2008 when a convicted felon named Armando Morales Jr., not to be confused with the man who found Chandra's remains, approached federal prosecutors with information about her murder. Morales was serving time in a Virginia prison on weapons charges and claimed his cellmate, Igmar Gondik, had confessed to killing a woman in Rock Creek Park. Gondik, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador, was already serving time for attacking 2 women in the same park in 2001. Both attacks had occurred within months of Chandra's disappearance, and both victims described being assaulted by a Hispanic man who tried to rob them on remote park trails. The jailhouse informant's letter to prosecutors provided details about Chandra's murder that had never been made public. According to Morales, Gondik had described trying to rob a young woman who fought back, leading to her death. The informant claimed Gondik had mentioned specific details about the crime scene and the victim's appearance. Detective Durant, now retired but still haunted by the unsolved case, was brought back as a consultant. He reviewed Gondik's previous attacks and found striking similarities to the circumstances of Chandra's disappearance. Both previous victims had been young women, exercising alone in isolated sections of the park. Both had been approached by a man speaking poor English, who had demanded money. Prosecutors began building a circumstantial case against Gondik. Phone records showed he had been in the Washington area on the day Chandra disappeared. His pattern of attacks in Rock Creek Park established opportunity and method. Most importantly, his cellmate's testimony provided what investigators hoped would be the confession evidence needed for conviction. The case against Gondik wasn't perfect. There was no DNA evidence linking him to Chandra's murder, and the jailhouse confession was inherently unreliable. But after 7 years without progress, prosecutors decided they had enough evidence to seek charges. On March 3, 2009, Igmar Gondik was indicted for the first-degree murder of Chandra and Levy. The indictment of Igmar Gondik sent shockwaves through the Levy family's carefully managed expectations. After 8 years of disappointment and false hope, they approached the news with cautious optimism, tempered by hard experience with setbacks. U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Taylor announced the charges at a press conference that finally gave the family the moment they'd waited for since 2001. Gondik was charged with first-degree murder while armed, attempted robbery while armed, and kidnapping. If convicted on all counts, he could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case would be prosecuted by Assistant U.S. Attorneys Fernando Campoamor Sanchez and Amanda Haynes, who had spent months reviewing every piece of evidence from the original investigation. They acknowledged that their case was largely circumstantial, but argued that the evidence taken together proved Gondik's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense attorney Santha Sonnenberg immediately began preparing for what would become one of Washington's most closely watched trials. She faced the challenge of defending a client who spoke limited English, had a history of violence against women, and was being tried in a case that had captured national attention for nearly a decade. The Levy family attended every pre-trial hearing, sitting in the front row as prosecutors and defense attorneys argued over evidence and jury selection. Susan Levy had waited so long for this moment that she sometimes seemed afraid to believe it was really happening. Pre-trial motions revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the prosecution's case. The jailhouse informant's testimony would be crucial, but the defense would argue that prisoners routinely fabricate confessions to curry favor with prosecutors. The pattern of Gondik's previous attacks was compelling circumstantial evidence, but prosecutors couldn't definitively place him at the crime scene. As 2009 ended, both sides prepared for a trial that would finally test whether justice could be achieved 9 years after Chandra's murder. The trial of Ingmar Gondik began on October 4, 2010 in the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. Nearly a decade after Chandra Levy's disappearance, her case would finally be decided by 12 jurors who knew the story only from headlines and now faced the responsibility of determining guilt or innocence based on evidence rather than speculation. Judge Gerald Fisher presided over a courtroom packed with media, victims' rights advocates, and members of the Levy family. Robert and Susan Levy sat in the front row every day, studying Gondik's face for any sign of remorse or recognition. The defendant, now 31, appeared smaller and less intimidating than the violent predator described in the prosecution's opening statement. Prosecutor Fernando Campoamor Sanchez methodically presented the case against Gondik. The evidence included his pattern of attacking women in Rock Creek Park, his presence in Washington when Chandra disappeared, and most crucially, the jailhouse confession recounted by his former cellmate Armando Morales Jr. The prosecution's case faced immediate challenges. The medical examiner testified that the cause of Chandra's death remained undetermined due to the advanced decomposition of her remains. No DNA evidence linked Gondik to the crime scene. The most damaging testimony came from Morales, who described in detail how Gondik had allegedly confessed to killing a female jogger in the park. Defense attorney Santha Sonnenberg attacked every element of the prosecution's case. She highlighted the lack of physical evidence and characterized Morales as an unreliable criminal who fabricated the confession to receive favorable treatment in his own case. She presented evidence that other violent criminals had been in the park around the time of Chandra's disappearance. The trial lasted 5 weeks with testimony from dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. Throughout it all, Gondik remained silent, speaking only to answer direct questions from the judge and declining to testify in his own defense. On November 22, 2010, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. Ingmar Gondik was convicted of first-degree murder while armed, attempted robbery while armed, and kidnapping in the death of Chandra and Levy. Susan Levy wept openly as the verdict was read. Nearly 10 years of grief and frustration finally validated by a jury's determination that her daughter's killer had been identified and held accountable. Robert Levy hugged prosecutors and whispered "thank you" repeatedly, his voice breaking with emotion. Judge Fisher scheduled sentencing for February 2011, but the verdict itself provided the closure the family had sought for so long. Outside the courthouse, Susan Levy addressed reporters with a statement she had probably rehearsed hundreds of times in her mind. Today, justice was served, she said, flanked by the prosecutors who had fought for her daughter. Chandra can finally rest in peace, knowing that her killer will spend the rest of his life in prison. This verdict cannot bring our daughter back, but it ensures that no other family will suffer as we have at the hands of this man. Gondik showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His defense attorney immediately announced plans to appeal, arguing that the conviction was based on unreliable testimony from a jailhouse informant seeking favorable treatment. She maintained her client's innocence and predicted the conviction would be overturned on appeal. The verdict made headlines across the country, with many outlets noting that justice had finally been achieved in one of Washington's most notorious unsolved murders. Editorial writers praised the persistence of the Levy family and the dedication of prosecutors who had refused to let the case remain cold. At sentencing 3 months later, Judge Fisher imposed a sentence of 60 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the 31-year-old Gondik. The Levys attended the sentencing hearing and finally heard the words they had waited nearly a decade to hear. The defendant will be remanded to federal custody for the remainder of his natural life. The years between 2011 and 2014 represented the closest thing to peace the Levy family had experienced since Chandra's disappearance. With Gondik imprisoned and appeals slowly making their way through the federal court system, Robert and Susan began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives around something other than the search for justice. Susan returned to volunteer work with victims' families, but now spoke from the unique perspective of someone who had achieved the resolution that so many others still sought. Her speeches at conferences and support groups carried new weight because she could offer hope based on personal experience rather than empty platitudes. The family established a scholarship fund in Chandra's memory at the University of Southern California, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in public service. The first recipients included young women who reminded Robert and Susan of their daughter's idealism and ambition. Gwandike remained housed in federal prison, reportedly maintaining his innocence despite the conviction. Prison correspondence obtained by reporters showed him writing to immigration advocates and claiming he had been framed because of his undocumented status. His lawyers continued filing appeals, but most legal experts considered his chances of overturning the conviction to be minimal. The case gradually faded from public attention as Washington moved on to new scandals and tragedies. Gary Condit had long since left politics and avoided public discussion of the case. The congressional hearings and police reforms that followed Chandra's murder had improved missing person investigations, but couldn't undo the failures that had complicated her case. Detective Durant, now fully retired, occasionally spoke to criminology classes about the investigation, emphasizing how technological advances and better coordination might have prevented some of the early mistakes. He still carried guilt about the missed opportunities, but took satisfaction in knowing the case had finally been resolved. For 3 years, it seemed like Chandra's story had reached its conclusion with justice served and her killer imprisoned, but the legal system had more surprises in store. The phone call that shattered the Levy family's carefully rebuilt peace came on July 28, 2015. Their attorney, Levy, delivered news that seemed impossible. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals had overturned Ingmar Gwandik's conviction for Chandra's murder. The three-judge panel had ruled unanimously that the trial court had made fundamental errors in admitting the testimony of jailhouse informant Armando Morales Jr. The appeals court found that Morales had given inconsistent statements about Gwandik's alleged confession and that the prosecution had failed to adequately disclose evidence that might have impeached his credibility. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, writing for the panel, noted that Morales had changed his story multiple times about when and how Gwandik had allegedly confessed. Most damaging to the prosecution's case, the appeals court found that prosecutors had not provided adequate notice to defense attorneys about Morales' expectations of favorable treatment in his own criminal cases. The cornerstone of the government's case was the testimony of a jailhouse informant who was, by his own admission, a liar and manipulator, Judge Brown wrote. When such testimony is infected by inconsistencies and undisclosed incentives, it cannot provide the foundation for a conviction that will stand on appeal. Susan Levy felt the familiar crushing weight of grief return as she processed the news. 5 years after celebrating Gwandiki's conviction, she was back where she started, with her daughter dead and no one held accountable for the crime. The appeals court had ordered a new trial, meaning the family would have to endure another courtroom ordeal with an even weaker case. Robert Levy struggled to contain his anger during a press conference announcing the family's response to the ruling. "This decision is a travesty of justice," he said, his voice shaking. "Our daughter deserves better than a system that allows killers to escape consequences because of technicalities." Prosecutors faced a difficult decision: retry Gwandik with a significantly weakened case, or admit that they couldn't prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On July 28, 2016, exactly 1 year after the appeals court overturned Gwandiki's conviction, U.S. Attorney Channing Phillips announced that federal prosecutors were dropping all charges against Ingmar Gwandik. Standing before reporters in the same courthouse where the family had celebrated justice 5 years earlier, Phillips delivered the devastating news that the case against Gwandik could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. "After careful consideration of the evidence and the appeals court's ruling, we have concluded that we cannot meet our burden of proof at retrial," Phillips said. "This does not mean we believe Mr. Gwandik is innocent. It means we cannot prove his guilt to the standard required by law." The decision meant that Chandra's murder officially returned to unsolved status after 15 years of investigation and legal proceedings. Gwandik, who had been held in federal custody since 2009, would be transferred to immigration authorities for deportation proceedings back to El Salvador. Susan Levy was too devastated to attend the press conference, but issued a statement through her attorney. "This decision reopens wounds that we thought had healed. After 15 years, we are back where we started, with our daughter's killer free and no justice in sight." The prosecution's decision highlighted the fundamental weaknesses that had plagued the case from the beginning. Without DNA evidence or reliable eyewitness testimony, the case had depended entirely on the credibility of a jailhouse informant whose story had fallen apart under appellate scrutiny. Defense attorney Santha Sonnenberg praised the prosecution's decision as long overdue. The government should never have brought charges based solely on the word of an admitted liar seeking favorable treatment, she said. My client has spent 7 years in federal custody for a crime he did not commit. The dropped charges left the Metropolitan Police Department's cold case unit with an officially unsolved murder and no new leads to pursue. After 15 years and millions of dollars in investigative costs, Chandra Levy's killer remained unknown and unpunished. The deportation of Igmar Guandique to El Salvador in May 2017 marked another painful milestone for the Levy family. The man who had been convicted of their daughter's murder, then cleared by the appeals court, was now beyond the reach of American justice entirely. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials escorted Guandique onto a plane at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, the same airport where Chandra had probably arrived full of hope for her Washington internship 16 years earlier. His deportation was carried out quietly, without media coverage or notification to the Levy family until after it was complete. In El Salvador, Guandique returned to a country ravaged by gang violence and economic instability, the same conditions that had driven him to enter the United States illegally as a teenager. Immigration authorities had no power to prevent him from attempting to re-enter the United States, though any such attempt would result in immediate arrest and prosecution for illegal re-entry. The Levy family struggled to process this final twist in their daughter's case. Robert told reporters that he felt abandoned by the justice system and wondered whether Chandra's murder would ever be solved. Susan focused her anger on the prosecutors, who had built a case around unreliable testimony, arguing that their rushed pursuit of a conviction had ultimately ensured that the real killer escaped accountability. Legal experts noted that Guandique's deportation effectively ended any possibility of charging him again if new evidence emerged. While he could theoretically be extradited from El Salvador, the weak government there had limited resources for cooperating with international prosecutions, and the United States had no diplomatic leverage to compel cooperation. Detective Durant, now completely removed from active law enforcement, told a local newspaper that he believed Guandique was guilty, but understood why the conviction couldn't stand. Sometimes the law doesn't give you the result you know is right, he said. But that's what separates us from countries where justice is whatever the government says it is. By 2018, the Levy family had learned to live with ambiguity in a way they never thought possible. With Chandra's killer either deported or still unknown, depending on one's interpretation of the evidence, Robert and Susan focused on preserving their daughter's memory and supporting other families facing similar tragedy. Susan became a national advocate for victims' rights, testifying before Congress about the need for better support systems for families of murder victims. Her speeches emphasized the secondary trauma inflicted by a justice system that promises closure but often delivers only frustration and false hope. Families like ours don't just lose a loved one, she told a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee. We lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect us. We learn that justice is not a guarantee, but a hope that may never be fulfilled. The scholarship fund established in Chandra's memory grew beyond the family's original modest goals, supported by donations from across the country. Recipients included young women pursuing careers in journalism, law enforcement, and public service, the fields where Chandra had hoped to make her mark. Robert channeled his business skills into consulting with police departments on missing person investigations, helping develop protocols that might prevent the mistakes that had hampered his daughter's case. His work led to improvements in computer forensics training and interagency coordination, potentially saving other families from experiencing similar investigative failures. The couple's marriage, tested by nearly 2 decades of grief and frustration, had evolved into something stronger than either had imagined possible. They supported each other through bad anniversaries and sudden waves of sorrow, understanding that healing didn't mean forgetting and that moving forward didn't require letting go of the past. Friends in Modesto noticed that the Levys had learned to speak about Chandra's life as often as her death, sharing stories about her humor, her ambition, and her kindness, rather than focusing exclusively on the circumstances of her disappearance. As 2019 marked 18 years since Chandra's disappearance, the Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit announced a comprehensive review of her murder file. Detective Johnny Kuhn, who had inherited the case from Durant's successors, promised to apply new forensic techniques and fresh investigative approaches to evidence that had been collected years earlier. The review included retesting DNA samples with advanced techniques that hadn't been available in 2002, when Chandra's remains were first examined. Kuhn also planned to re-interview surviving witnesses and review thousands of pages of documents that had accumulated over nearly 2 decades of investigation. Technology has advanced significantly since this case began, Kuhn told reporters. We're looking at everything with fresh eyes and new tools. The Levy family deserves our best effort, and that's what they're going to get. Susan Levy met with Detective Kuhn, but approached the renewed investigation with guarded optimism. After the disappointment of Gwondake's overturned conviction, she was reluctant to invest too much hope in promises of breakthrough evidence or dramatic new leads. The DNA review yielded partial profiles that hadn't been detected in earlier testing, but none matched any suspects in the federal database. The re-interviews produced new details about potential suspects who had been in Rock Creek Park around the time of Chandra's disappearance, but no evidence strong enough to support charges. Meanwhile, true crime podcasters and amateur investigators continued analyzing the case on social media, generating theories that ranged from plausible to ridiculous. Some focused on other violent criminals who had been active in Washington in 2001. Others returned to questions about Gary Condit's role, despite his having been thoroughly investigated and cleared by both police and federal agents. The renewed attention kept Chandra's story alive, but also subjected the Levy family to fresh rounds of speculation and conspiracy theories. They had learned to ignore most of the amateur theories, while remaining grateful for any legitimate leads that emerged from public interest in the case. The 20th anniversary of Chandra's disappearance in May 2021 was marked by a somber vigil in Modesto's Graysada Park, where friends and family gathered to remember a young woman whose story had become synonymous with unsolved justice and parental determination. The COVID-19 pandemic had limited attendance, but dozens of community members maintained social distance while lighting candles and listening to Susan Levy read from letters Chandra had sent home during her Washington internship. The letters revealed a young woman excited about her work but homesick for California's familiar rhythms. She wrote about the museums she wanted to visit and the monuments she planned to see, Susan read, her voice carrying across the quiet park. She had such plans for her future. She was going to change the world, and maybe she still has, just not in the way any of us expected. Robert Levy spoke about the investigations, legal proceedings, and appeals that had consumed 2 decades of their lives. He thanked the law enforcement officers who had worked the case, even those whose mistakes had complicated the search for justice. He acknowledged that they might never know who killed their daughter, but insisted that didn't diminish her life or their love for her. The vigil attracted new media attention, with reporters noting how the Levys had aged over 20 years of public grief. Photographs from the anniversary showed a couple transformed by tragedy, but not defeated by it, still fighting for their daughter's memory, even as hope for legal resolution faded. Detective Kuhn attended the vigil and privately assured the family that the investigation remained active. He had no new leads to announce, but promised that Chandra's case would never be officially closed as long as he was responsible for it. As candles flickered in the gathering darkness, the community that had embraced the Levy family's pain seemed to accept that some stories don't end with justice served, but with love remembered. 2 years later, in 2023, the Chandra Levy case returned to headlines when the Metropolitan Police Department announced they were accepting new tips through a dedicated hotline and email address. The announcement coincided with advances in genealogical DNA testing that had solved decades-old cold cases across the country. Detective Kuhn explained that the department was exploring whether genetic genealogy might yield new leads in Chandra's murder. The technique, which had famously identified the Golden State Killer and other long-sought criminals, involved using DNA evidence to build family trees that could lead investigators to potential suspects. "We're not making any promises," Coon cautioned during a press conference attended by the Levy family, "but we owe it to Chandra and her family to try every available tool. If there's a way to solve this case, we're going to find it." The announcement generated hundreds of tips from around the country, most offering recycled theories, but some providing potentially useful information about people who had been in Rock Creek Park during 2001. Detective Kuhn and his team systematically investigated each lead, though none immediately produced breakthrough evidence. Susan Levy participated in a true crime podcast about her daughter's case, hoping that renewed public attention might generate the tip that had eluded investigators for over 2 decades. She spoke candidly about the toll that 22 years of uncertainty had taken on her family, but emphasized that she would never stop seeking answers. "People ask if I think we'll ever know who killed Chandra," she said during the podcast interview. "I don't know, but I know we'll never stop trying to find out. That's what you do when you love someone. You don't give up on them even when everyone else thinks you should." The police department's renewed commitment provided modest hope, but the Levy family had learned to measure progress in small steps rather than dramatic breakthroughs. After more than 2 decades, they understood that justice delayed might well be justice denied. Today, as this story closes, the murder of Chandra Ann Levy remains officially unsolved. Her case file sits in the Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit, thick with 23 years of witness statements, forensic reports, legal documents, and investigative leads that led nowhere. Detective Kuhn checks it periodically, hoping for the breakthrough that has remained elusive since 2001. But Robert and Susan Levy, now in their 70s, continue living in Modesto surrounded by photo albums that chronicle their daughter's life before she became a headline. The graduation pictures, family vacations, and casual snapshots serve as reminders that Chandra was more than a murder victim. She was a young woman with dreams, hopes, and the promise of a future that was stolen on a spring day in Washington. The family has learned to find meaning in their advocacy work rather than waiting for legal resolution. Susan's speeches to victims' families and Robert's consulting work with police departments represent their daughter's legacy in ways that a criminal conviction never could. They have turned their pain into purpose, helping other families navigate the bewildering maze of investigations and legal proceedings. Chandra's Scholarship Fund continues supporting young women pursuing public service careers, fulfilling in small ways the ambition she never got to achieve. Each recipient represents a life that might change the world in ways Chandra never had the chance to attempt. The Washington that Chandra knew, a city of monuments, ambition where young people came to change the world, continues its rhythms largely unchanged. New interns arrive each semester full of hope and purpose, many unaware of the young woman who disappeared while chasing similar dreams. Rock Creek Park remains a popular destination for joggers and walkers, its trails traversed daily by people who never heard Chandra's name. But for those who remember, every shadow beneath the trees carries the whisper of an unsolved mystery and a family's unending love.